Stone Brothers production.
Hello, welcome back to the Serial Killer series. This is part 2 of the Illinois serial killers, and me and my twin brother will be speaking in this video. This is about 7 infamous serial killers in Illinois.
Number 7. Lester Harrison. Harrison was first arrested at the age of 22 in 1945, and he got a 5 to 10 year prison sentence for an armed robbery charge in Chicago.
While he was locked up, he killed another inmate, Norman Kimmey, in November 1951.
The inmate murdered was a convicted murderer, and Harrison went to the state hospital after he was incompetent for trial. While on parole, he got 8 more convictions on charges of larceny, attempted armed robbery, unlawful use of a weapon, battery, and indecent exposure.
Harrison skipped bail a few times, which he was sent back to the state hospital for diagnosis and treatment.
Harrison was found competent for trial on robbery charges in March 1972 and was sentenced to 18 months in prison.
He was then released by a judge for time served during psychiatric evaluations.
During his crime spree, no one expected him to be involved in a string of brutal homicides committed around Grant Park in downtown Chicago.
The first victim, Agnes Lehman, who was beaten to death near Park's bandshell on July 10, 1970, and her body was found the next morning.
A shoe was found at the scene, linking it to Wilbur McDonald, who was arrested 12 days later as he was unconscious by the railroad tracks.
McDonald said he admitted speaking with Lehman the night of her death, but insisted a black man rushed them from the darkness and assaulted them both.
Jurors didn't believe the story, convicting McDonald of murder and sentenced him to 100 to 150 years in prison. On September 5, 1972, authorities reopened the case after Judith Bedelet was beaten to death a few yards away from the old murder scene. 3 weeks later, Harrison was charged with assaulting a 31-year-old Cosetta Gladys, knocking her down with a brick and dragging her to a dark alleyway in Chicago.
After being released on a $5,000 bond on September 28th and then being indicted in a trial on December 29th,
the judge passed the bail despite his violent record and long history of mental disorders. Harrison's trial was still pending in July 1973 when Irene Koutros was stabbed to death in Grant Park's underground garage. On August 3rd, Lee Wilson was fatally stabbed to death in the park proper, and her assailant paused to bite on her body before escaping.
On August 13th, he struck again, stabbing to death a 28-year-old Judith Ott with a knife in a park restroom.
Her husband, David Ott, saw a black man running from where she was murdered. David chased and tackled Harrison, unaware of his wife being murdered during that time. While Harrison was in custody, he confessed to 4 murders in Grant Park, but he denies the murder in the case of Irene Koutros. Harrison mentioned he got aroused by beating and stabbing his victims to death. Defense delayed Harrison's murder trial until 1978 when he was acquitted of his crimes for reason of insanity.
Later, prosecutors stepped in a way for a special hearing to have Harrison declared sexually dangerous and have him confined under a little-used law.
By May 1986, 62-year-old quadriplegic Harrison found attorneys to seek his release from state custody.
His lawyers described Harrison being harmless, asserting he could hardly move in his current condition. There were a few testimonies from the state hospital suggesting that Harrison can move his arms around.
Also, they mentioned he would get sexually aroused by nurses entering his room.
The petition for Harrison's release was withdrawn on August 11, 1986.
Number 6. Geoffrey Griffin. From July of 1998 to July 2000, Geoffrey Griffin used the neighborhoods of Roseland area of Chicago as his personal killing fields. I could not find much on his early life, though before these events he was arrested for possession of a controlled substance. All of Griffin's victims were African American, found in abandoned buildings in or near Roseland area. Most of his victims engaged in high-risk lifestyles, such as prostitution and substance abuse, which most were lured that way to their deaths. Griffin, who was released from Illinois' River Correctional Center, served a year for aggravated battery with intent to do bodily harm to an alleged victim, was also a suspect in 6 other murders. Police even have a videotaped statement in his role in killing of Jones, but he denied any other connections to the 6 other murders who died in a similar fashion. Police regret at the time not taking a DNA sample from Griffin because most of the victims had DNA from the crime scenes, which they got a huge amount of backlash on. The 6 victims all died from blunt trauma to the head. Most of them were found naked, and all the women received head trauma occurred from blunt objects or by knuckles from the suspect. All the victims were left bleeding to death internally and externally, some found with their eyes being burned out of the sockets with such brutality. According to court documents, from his assault with Sharp, who survived after being beaten unconscious and her face burned with a lighter in 1999, police had him but just let him go because of not enough evidence. Griffin's relatives believed Griffin was not the right man for when he killed Jones.
A sister of Griffin helped his plea more because of stating they are just accusing him of a past aggravated battery conviction and state that he was beaten into confessing. Lawyers got Griffin out of jail, though he went back to his killing ways and slain more women.
Eventually he had gotten arrested and confessed to killing Jones. He was officially arrested on 8 counts of murder and 1 aggravated criminal sexual assault. If his DNA sample was taken for his previous assault back in 1995, police would have caught him before he murdered up to 8 women. Number 5. Larry Bright.
From July 2003 until late 2004, Larry Bright went on a 15-month killing spree of 8 women, whose bodies were found in Peoria and Tazewell counties, Illinois.
Bright admitted to strangling 7 of the women and admitted to the other death was drug-induced with 1/8 of cocaine. Most of his victims were given cocaine and killed after having sex with them. Barbara Williams was the victim that overdosed from cocaine, but he admitted to punching her in the throat and started choking her to death.
He'd either dumped the victims along rural roads or burned in his fire pit in his backyard. On May 30th, 2006, Bright pleaded guilty to 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of drug-induced homicide. Larry Bright was sentenced to natural life on each of the 7 counts of the first-degree murder.
As a part of his plea agreement, Bright waived all his rights to appeal. Number 4. Milton Johnson, aka the Weekend Murderer. The Illinois native born in 1951, before his murder spree, was convicted of raping a 19-year-old girl in Joliet. He tortured her with a cigarette lighter in the process. He got sentenced to 25 to 35 years in prison, with a consecutive term of 5 to 10 years for a burglary conviction. Authorities released him 3 years early on March 10, 1983, and giving him early release caused the death of 10 lives. From June 25th to August 25th, 1983, he terrorized Joliet and surrounding communities with a series of random weekend murders.
Law enforcement searched everywhere in Will County in a search for the suspect, but the killer managed to elude them, slaughtering his victims.
A lot of residents would stock up on guns and bullets in fear from the killer.
The crime spree started with the deaths of 2 Will County sisters on Saturday, June 25th.
A week later, on July 2nd, Kenneth and Terry Johnson were shot to death without any motives, and their bodies were discarded in the southwestern Cook County.
On July 16th, 5 victims, including 2 deputy sheriffs, were killed, and authorities consider the murders a random wholesale slaughter.
A month later, the violence escalated.
On August 20th, 1983, police claimed Johnson killed 4 women in a Joliet ceramic shop.
There were no solid clues in the slayings for the police to search for. A day later, the killer shifted to the Park Forest, in Cook County, binding 40-year-old Ralph Dixon and 25-year-old Crystal Knight before slashing their throats in Dixon's own apartment. He stabbed the women 20 times.
On August 25th, he wasn't so lucky when he murdered 82-year-old Anna Johnson and was apprehended soon after.
On March 9, 1984, Johnson was arrested while visiting his parole officer and is charged with aggravated battery and sexual assault in the rape of Anthony Hackett's fiancée. One of his victims memorized Johnson's license plate number, leading to his arrest.
Evidence was collected at various murder scenes, linking Johnson to 10 Will County murders. Johnson was convicted of all counts in September 1984, receiving a death sentence. 4 months later, on January 23, 1986, Johnson was convicted of the quadruple murder for the Ceramic Shop Massacre.
Johnson got his second death sentence 5 days later after being convicted for the massacre.
Prosecutors had the other 5 slayings indefinitely dropped after all his other sentences went through.
Number 3. Johann Hoch. Johann was born legally named John Schmidt in 1855 in Horweiler, Germany. There is not much known about his early life, though he married Christine Ram and had 3 to 4 children in 1887. Before his marriage, he stopped working for his father and switched his study towards pharmacy and worked at several pharmacies, which helped Johann gain his knowledge on drugs and poisons. His first wife, whose name is unknown, was married to Johann for 2 years before he buried her in 1883. Her death was unknown, but some people said he killed his first wife with a poison cocktail. Shortly after leaving Ram, his second wife, he left with her savings and married again in a neighboring town. Johann moved to the States and out of the States multiple times to avoid attention to his constant name changes. Sources stated that he murdered his first wife in New York in 1883. It is rumored that Johann married an immigrant servant girl who died 2 months after marrying him. He continued marrying wives and living off their income while allegedly working random jobs from servant working to pharmaceutical work. Eventually, Johann moved to Chicago, Illinois in 1892. Soon after he married Hoyle, and she died the same year he married her. Johann killed 2 more wives the same year of 1892, both wives only being alive for 3 weeks to a month after he married them, all going under 2 different aliases. Johann married 3 more times with 2 different aliases and killed 3 more wives between 1883 and 1895 before finally being arrested under the alias C.A. Calford. He was arrested for leaving his wife Janet Spencer and stealing a couple $100s from her. Also, Johann was allegedly charged with the diamond robbery of Huldah Stevens. After this, he went on and killed another wife the same year and faked his death and took a surname of Hulk. He then moved to another location in Chicago during the same year and bought a salon with the remaining cash he had. During the same year in 1895, he killed another spouse after 4 months of being married to her and sold her house for $4,000. He then moved on to another woman where he stole her money and allegedly moved back to Germany. Later, he had escaped back to Chicago due to a warrant for his arrest in Germany. After about 3 years, Johann married about 12 other spouses from 3 different states while stealing every wife's money. Unfortunately, 3 of the 12 wives he married died. Johann also continued to use multiple different aliases, which investigators of his other crimes could not link him correctly due to his illegal ways of marrying his spouses. Police finally got a break, stopping him from murdering other women and arrested him after trying to sell already mortgaged furniture. In 1899 to 1905, after being released from prison, he went on and married over 15 wives while murdering a few of those who did not want to share their wealth. Eventually, all of Johann's crimes caught up with him when he was charged with the murder of his second-to-last wife, Maria. Johann was questioned and later an arrest warrant was issued. Police got a tip from a landlady who mentioned that Johann tried convincing to marry her after 24 hours of meeting her. She told him that she was convinced that he was a suspect in the murder of Maria because of different aliases investigators caught on and charged him with her murder. Though Johann avoided hanging multiple times, he was hung almost a year later due to concrete evidence. Johann was hung on February 23, 1906 for the heinous crimes he committed from robbery, kidnapping, and even murder. All of his victims' family finally have clarity on how their daughter, mother, cousin, or sister have died. Number 2. Herman Mudgett. Mudgett was better known as Dr. H. H. Holmes and was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. As an adult, he abandoned his young wife and child in 1885 and moved to Illinois. In Illinois, he changed his name to H. H. Holmes. Soon after, he got a job at a pharmacy located by Jackson Park. 8 years later, Jackson Park would become the site of the 1893 World's Fair, and it was called the Columbian Exposition. It was designed by the top America's leading architects and included exhibits from more than 40 countries. Holmes took advantage of many visitors who went to the city, including young women who went to Chicago looking for jobs at the fairgrounds. Historians considered Holmes a master con artist and swindled money from his drugstore employers. He purchased an empty lot in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago and built a labyrinth structure with shops on the first floor and small apartments above. This property was coined the Murder Castle because of the soundproof rooms, secret passages, maze of hallways, and staircases. Also, the rooms had trapdoors built over chutes that dropped unsuspecting victims to the basement of his property. The basement contained a disturbing facility of acid vats, pits of quicklime for decaying corpses, and a crematorium that the killer used to finish off his victims. Holmes lured many visitors that went to the Columbian Exposition, then going to his sinister lair with the promise of cheap lodgings. One of Holmes' early murder victims was his mistress, Julia Smythe. She was the wife of Ned Connor, who had moved into Holmes' building and began working at his pharmacy's jewelry counter. After Connor found out about his wife's affair with Holmes, he quit his job and moved away, leaving his wife and his daughter Pearl behind. She gained custody of her daughter Pearl, remained at Holmes' property, and continued her relationship with Holmes. Julia and Pearl went missing on Christmas Eve of 1891, and Holmes later claimed that she died during an abortion. He continued to murder 2 more women who worked or lived in his murder castle in 1892. Holmes met and became close friends with Benjamin Pitezel, who was a carpenter with a criminal past. Holmes had Benjamin as his right-hand man for several criminal schemes. Later, Holmes fled Chicago in October 1893. On November 17, 1894, Holmes was arrested in Boston for the alleged murder of his criminal assistant Benjamin and 2 of his children. Authorities eventually discovered one of the bodies of the murdered children, which led to Holmes' arrest. After his arrest, Holmes claimed he had killed over 200 people in his murder castle. However, he ultimately confessed to 27 murders, including Benjamin and his 2 daughters. Some experts believe he may have killed as few as 9, in which is still a considerable amount. He was sentenced to death on October 1895 for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. During his trial and short prison term while on death row, he wrote an autobiography called Holmes' Own Story. After a brief prison stay, Holmes was hanged for his crimes in Philadelphia in 1896, and his body was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery outside of Pennsylvania City. Number 1. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942, being the second of 3 children from Marianne and John Gacy Sr. He enrolled into business school and graduated in 1863. Gacy excelled in his first job after college, being a management trainee at a footwear company in Springfield, Illinois. Gacy was an avid supporter of several different organizations for helping the community out. He was first known to dressing up as a clown to entertain sick children in hospitals. In September of 1964, Gacy married coworker Marilyn Myers, and his new father-in-law asked him to move to Iowa. Gacy was offered a new position within a fast food chain by his father-in-law, being KFC, where he managed 3 stores. His wife had 2 children with Gacy during that time, both being a boy and girl. Rumors spread that Gacy was making sexual advances to young employees at his father-in-law's franchise restaurants. May of 1968, he was indicted for allegedly sodomizing a teenage employee, Mark Miller. Gacy maintained his innocence, claiming the sex was consensual. However, 4 months later, Gacy was charged with hiring a young man, Dwight Anderson, to beat up Mark Miller. He managed to escape the attack and having Anderson arrested, who confessed to having Gacy hiring him to attack him. Gacy was charged and pleaded guilty to the sodomy charge and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. His wife divorced him while he was in prison in 1969 and never saw his children again. He was paroled on June 18, 1970 after serving 18 months and moved back to Illinois to live with his mother. Gacy got a job as a chef in a Chicago restaurant. In 1971, with his mother's financial assistance, he bought a ranch-style house just outside of Chicago. He developed a great relationship with his neighbors, sharing festive occasions, and they were oblivious of his criminal conviction. On June 1, 1972, Gacy married for the second time, being a divorcee with 2 daughters named Carol Hoff. She was aware of his prison term, but she trusted him from staying away from his old ways. He continued to work in the community and still dressing up as a clown to entertain sick children and going to children's parties. He was considered a good guy in his neighborhoods, throwing huge parties and barbecues. People started to notice a curious smell that came from the floor soon after, which Gacy blamed it on moisture buildup in the crawlspace under his house. His first murder was on January 2nd, 1972, when Gacy picked up 16-year-old Timothy McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal. He told McCoy that he could spend the night and he would drive him back to the station in time to catch his bus. According to Gacy's later confession, Gacy awoke to McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway with the kitchen knife in his hand. Gacy then leaped from his bed and McCoy raised both his arms in a gesture of surrender. While he raised his arms up with the knife, he accidentally cut Gacy in the arm with the knife. Gacy then twisted the knife from McCoy's wrist, banged his head against his bedroom wall, and then kicked him against his wardrobe and walked towards him. McCoy defended himself by kicking Gacy in the stomach, and then Gacy wrestled him to the floor. He then went on top of him and stabbed McCoy in the chest multiple times. Gacy realized after killing him that McCoy was cooking for them and he didn't realize that he had the knife for cooking. He then buried McCoy in his crawlspace and later covered him with a layer of concrete. In an interview after his arrest, he mentioned he felt drained after his first murder, noting that he got an ultimate thrill after killing the young man. Gacy later stated his second murder was committed around January of 1974. The victim was unknown and believed to be between the age of 14 to 18 who was strangled by Gacy. He stated that he put the teenager in his closet prior to burying him. Gacy later stated that fluid was coming out of the young man's mouth and nose and staining his carpet. Later, Gacy stated he stuffed clothes or their underwear in his later victim's mouths to prevent any other evidence like his second victim. By 1975, Gacy started his own business, PDM Contractors, being a construction company. During that time, his marriage began to fall apart. His sex life stopped at some point and he would go out all night. His wife Carol found wallets with IDs of young men lying around and Gacy would bring gay porn into the house. They divorced in March of 1976, but he committed multiple murders during their marriage. In July of 1975, one of Gacy's employees, John Butkovich, disappeared after an argument over being owed money. The victim's parents asked police to check out Gacy, but they did nothing and the young man's disappearance went unsolved. Most of his murders were committed between 1976 to 1978. They considered those years the cruising years after having his house to himself after his wife divorced him. He murdered a few more employees that worked for him. He had been very lucky during that time, not being noticed by police for his previous criminal record. Gacy started getting tired of digging holes in his crawlspace and he wanted more space that was available for his future victims. He hired one of his employees, David Krim, to make more space and he even stayed in one of Gacy's spare bedrooms. One night, Krim came back from work and found Gacy drunk in his clown costume. They both had a few drinks and then Gacy tricked Krim into handcuffs. While handcuffed, Gacy started to spin Krim around the room screaming, "I'm going to rape you," but he pushed Gacy down and escaped the room. A month later, Gacy went into Krim's room telling him he was going to rape him and defended himself from Gacy assaulting him. Krim moved out of Gacy's place, leaving PDM Contractors, although he worked for Gacy periodically for the 2 following years. Gacy had another employee, 18-year-old Michael Rossi, moved into his house. He had him dig trenches in the crawlspace and even had him spread limes to help with decomposition. By 1978, Gacy ran into a problem with his crawlspace being full. It was so full that he stacked the bodies, sometimes 3 deep. Later during his killing spree, he began dumping bodies along the Des Plaines River. One of Gacy's victims survived after luring Jeffrey Rignall into his car in March of 1978. Gacy chloroformed the young man, took him back to the house, raped and tortured him, and dumped his body in Lincoln Park. One of his last murders that ended his killing spree that led up to his arrest was of 15-year-old Robert Piest. The 15-year-old boy disappeared on December 11, 1978 from the Des Plaines pharmacy where he worked after school. One of the coworkers stated that Piest told him about going to a house down the street to talk to a contractor about a job. Police called him the next day and he denied talking to Robert. The local police searched Gacy's record, discovering that he served a prison term for a sodomy conviction. This led up to a search of Gacy's house on December 13, 1978. During the search, they found suspicious items in his home. The items were a 1975 high school class ring, driver's licenses for other people, handcuffs, a 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends, a syringe, clothing too small for Gacy, and a photo receipt from a pharmacy where Robert worked. Detectives noticed a nasty odor coming from the crawlspace beneath the house. By this time, they had constant surveillance of Gacy while they continued their investigation. On December 15th, the high school class ring was traced back to John Schitz being one of his employees. Also, early investigators of John mentioned that one of Gacy's employees, Michael Rossi, drove a car similar to the victim's vehicle. On December 17th, investigators interviewed Michael, who told him that Gacy sold John's vehicle to him because the young teen needed money to move to California. During the interview, he stated that in summer of 1977, Gacy had him spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of the house. On December 20th, both David Crim and Michael Rossi were interviewed by investigators. When Michael was asked about where Gacy hid Robert's body, he replied he could have put him in the crawl space. Also, Michael mentioned he dug trenches in the crawl space and said Gacy insisted him to not move where he was instructed to dig. On December 13th, Cram stated that Gacy had him dig trenches, explaining it was for plumbing. Cram stated that the trenches were the size of graves, being 2 feet wide, 6 feet long, and 2 feet deep. On December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office, appearing disarranged. He then asked for an alcoholic drink from his lawyer, Sam Amarante. His lawyer fetched a bottle of whiskey from his car and asked Gacy what he wanted to talk with him about. He then gave a rambling confession of his murders that ran into the early hours of the following morning. He stated he killed around 30 people. When he awoke in his lawyer's office after passing out, he stated his arrest was inevitable. He stated that in his final hours he intended to visit his friends and say his final farewells. After leaving the lawyer's office, he drove to a Shell's gas station where he handed a small bag of cannabis to an attendant, Lance Jacobson. He then told the young man that the end was coming for him. Soon after, he left and drove to various locations. Authorities were radioed reports from the surveillance detectives at the gas stations about the marijuana. They also said that he had erratic behaviors. Police decided to arrest him upon possession and distribution of marijuana because they were thinking he was going to commit suicide. At 4:30 p.m. on the afternoon of December 21st, while Gacy was in custody, the request of a second search warrant was granted by a judge. Police and evidence technicians quickly drove to Gacy's home. When they arrived, they found that he unplugged the sump pump to flood the crawl space with water. After they stopped the flooding problems, they waited for the water to drain and enter the crawl space in the southwest area. Within minutes of digging, they uncovered flesh and a human arm bone. The evidence technician Daniel Genty then shouted out to investigators that they could charge Gacy with murder. He then said that he thinks the place is full of kids. In the early hours of December 22, 1978, Gacy confessed to the police that since 1972 he killed 25 to 30 people. He also talked about what he did to most of his victims. He stated that he lost count on the number of victims buried in his crawl space. He mentioned his final victims were being disposed off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. From December 22nd to December 29th, 1978, 27 bodies were recovered from Gacy's home after drawing out a diagram of his basement where the bodies were buried. Leading into 1979, police recovered a total of 30 or more bodies. After all the countless testimonies from over 100 witnesses in a 5-week period, the jury found Gacy guilty on March 12, 1980. On March 13th, the day after being found guilty, he was convicted of 33 murders and was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders. While on death row, he began painting in his prison cells of various things, although many of his paintings were of clowns. On the morning of May 9, 1984, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill to be executed. For his final meal, he ate a bucket of KFC chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, french fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. Before getting the lethal injection, his final words were, "Kiss my ass." Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1984. I hope you're enjoying my content. Please slam that like button, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon below the video to get future updates when I upload. I greatly appreciate it, and I will update you on my social media for my next video. I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you on the next video.